little bit of time talking about the approach I take for writing historical fiction in general, and the kind of research that requires. And I was struck by the fact when I started first thinking about this, that no one has ever lived in the past. Throughout history, there's never been anything such as the past, because it's always the present for whoever we are talking about. That and the past does not have the same shape or concept as our present does, whether it's the 5th century BC or the 1800s or 1940. These are all really different people, and we have to understand as readers and as writers what that means for historical fiction. I just want to read a quote from a 19th century historian from Boston, John Lothrop Motley. And what Motley said in very florid 19th century prose was, "There is no such thing as human history. Nothing can be more profoundly and sadly true. The annals of mankind have never been written, never can be written, nor would it be within human capacity to read them if they were written. We have a leaf or two from the great book of human fate as it flutters in the storm winds ever sweeping the earth. We decipher them as best we can with poor blind eyes, and endeavor to learn their mystery as we float along to the abyss. But it is all confused babble, hieroglyphics of which the key is lost." So Motley was maybe overstating it a little bit, but his point was we really can't understand the past because people from generations ago are profoundly different from us. And for me, the challenge is to remember, as I write these books set during the Second World War, that the men and women who grew up in the Depression and went off to fight in this great conflict are profoundly different than we are. Their world is not our world. When they lived, the average life expectancy was less than 55 years. Ours is almost 80. They came from an economy that ran on agriculture and rural activities and industrial production. Ours is a service-based industry, totally different. They had no social security, no backdrop to fall on. Travel was virtually unknown, or reserved only for people who had to go somewhere to work, or people who were rich enough to do it. And think about a 20-year-old in 1940. They could think back and feel comfortable with historical figures like Abraham Lincoln or Mark Twain through general knowledge, or maybe even people that knew them, and they could understand those people. But flip it around and have them think about people 70 years ahead of them, like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg. They would have no conception of what these people were even about. So that's what I try to keep in mind, is that I'm really writing stories about people who are profoundly different from us. And most importantly, as I'm writing in a historical vein, I know what happens next, but these people don't. These characters don't. And I have to work very diligently to make sure that no hint of their future creeps into the narrative, because they don't know. They don't know what's going to happen next. If I'm writing in 1944, they really don't know how the war is going to end and what they're going to find. And this came to me very profoundly, and I still remember this very clearly, when I started the second book in the series, The First Wave. I started writing that the week after 9/11. And I remember that looking up at the empty sky and realizing it was the first time for me that in history, feeling history and not knowing what was going to happen next. And that's the feeling that I try to share with the reader through these characters is a sense of being rooted in their present and not knowing what's going to happen next. And one way to do that is to do research that's a process of total immersion. So if I'm writing about a particular battle or a particular issue during World War II or a setting, I really go overboard in researching it until the data just comes out of my pores, and I know when it's time to start writing. Hemingway had a quote when something like the majesty of the iceberg floating in water is that 9/10 of it is invisible beneath the surface. And he was talking about research, and that you can do as much research as you need. And if you do enough of it, you don't need to tell the reader everything, because it comes across in how you communicate the information, that you're comfortable enough to have a sense of what it was like to live in that time and place. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Had an essay that he titled "History and National Stupidity." It's a very good essay. And in that he said, history is not self-executing. You do not put a coin in the slot and have history come out. For the past is a chaos of events and personalities into which we cannot penetrate. It is beyond retrieval, and it is beyond reconstruction. So that's a challenge for a novelist, because he's right, for the same reason that Motley was right, that we really can't understand the people in the past because they're so profoundly different from us. The way to approach that as a writer is through small accuracies, details that might only be known to somebody who lived at that time, and threading those through the narrative so that it generates a feeling of authenticity without doing what they call a data dump of just delivering information. That's not what the writing process is about. The writer Thomas Mallon said it really well. Only through tiny, literal accuracies can the historical novelist achieve the larger truth to which he aspires, namely, an overall feeling of authenticity. It is just like Marianne Moore's famous prescription for the ideal poet. He must stock his imaginary garden with real toads. So that's my little lesson about historical fiction. And one of my favorite quotes about that is from Oscar Wilde, who said, the one duty we owe to history is to rewrite it. And when I first came across that, I thought it was a joke, but it really isn't. We have to take what we know about history and weave it into a story with characters that make sense, that work in their time and place, and then tell a story that illuminates what their experience was at that time. So the vehicle for doing all this for me is the Billy Boyle series, and this is number 17 in the series, From the Shadows. And each book, for those of you that might not be familiar with it, is set during a real historical event during World War II. The first book dealt with the Norwegian government in exile in Great Britain and how they had smuggled the gold reserves of the country ahead of the Nazi invasion. And each book along the way has dealt with a real historical event with fictional characters. And I use crime fiction as a way to insert my characters into the historical setting, that I generate a crime that needs to be investigated that is often related to the event that I want to talk about. And for this one, I had long wanted to write about the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And this was a unit of Japanese American citizens who who enlisted in the Army at a time of a lot of racial prejudice about Japanese Americans. You probably all have heard of the internment camps that they sent American citizens. I mean, they were Japanese Americans, but these were American citizens who, with no due process, were taken from the Western states, about the 1/3 of the nation, and herded with, again, no due process, herded into internment camps because the government suspected that they might be linked to the Japanese invasion. Oddly enough, the one island that had a very large population of Japanese Americans was Hawaii, and they didn't inter anybody in Hawaii because there were a lot of Japanese Americans there, and there was no place to put an internment camp. So the one place where there might have been some logic to it, they didn't even do it. But a lot of these families lost everything, lost their businesses, lost their houses, and were sent into camps that were, they were literally concentration camps, because the term concentration camp comes from what the British did in South Africa, where they removed, during the Boer War, they removed the population and concentrated them in camps so that they could keep track of them. And that's really what these camps were. They were horrible places. Some of them constructed in swamps, others on open plains. And even though a lot of these Japanese Americans, these young men who were there with their families, felt that they had been severely wronged, they wanted to serve their country. So they were agitating to be able to join the army. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, there was an existing battalion of Japanese Americans. It was the 100th Battalion, Hawaiian National Guard, all Japanese American citizens. And again, ironically, with all this racial panic about Japanese Americans, they kept them as a battalion. They disarmed them right after Pearl Harbor, put them to work as a construction battalion. But then pretty soon they realized that these guys were well trained and knew what they were doing, and they brought them to the States for training. At the same time, 2 battalions of men from the internment camps were raised, and they were also sent to Louisiana for training. As a lot of GIs were in the war. And then the Army decided that, well, we've got this 1 battalion from Hawaii, we've got these guys from mainlanders, and so we'll put them together and form a regimental combat team. And what that really meant was that they didn't want to integrate this unit with the predominantly white, oh no, the all-white Army. So they kept them as a separate unit. They went on to be the most highly decorated unit in the history of the American Army, but it almost didn't happen. And it wasn't, in this case, it wasn't because of the government, it was because of a clash between the Hawaiians and the mainlanders. So when they were brought together, talk about people from different backgrounds, the guys from Hawaii had really grown up in a multicultural environment. There were all sorts of Native Islanders, Native Hawaiians, Japanese Americans, Chinese. It was a real mix. And they lived a pretty healthy outdoor life. A lot of them worked in the sugarcane fields, and as opposed to the guys on the mainland who worked, a lot of them worked with their families in businesses and didn't have the same shared experience. So when they came together, they had names for each group, and the mainlanders called the Hawaiians Buddha heads, because a lot of them were Buddhist. The Hawaiians called the mainlanders katonks. And the story goes that they called them katonks because they said when they got in a fight with them, that's the sound their head made when it hit the floor. Katonk. So they really didn't get along. The Hawaiian guys were heavily into gambling. They liked to, when they had a weekend leave, they liked to go to town and drink. And the mainland guys didn't share that with them. They didn't go off and spend a lot of money with them. And there was really a lack of understanding. And finally, the commanding officer, who was a white guy, all the officers at first were white, realized what might be going on. And the mainland guys were very reticent to talk about what life had been like in the camps, the internment camps. And there was a sense of shame that they held about being taken away from their life, being forced into these camps, and the conditions in which their parents and their loved ones still lived. And they kept very quiet about it. So this was while they were still training in Louisiana. There was an internment camp in Arkansas, not terribly far away. So the CO got a representative group from the Hawaiian battalion, put them on buses, sent them to visit the camp. And when they got there, their eyes were opened because they had sort of believed the government about, these are, nice camps and, they're beautiful facilities and out in the country. And this was in one of the camps that was built on a swamp. And a lot of the guys from the mainland who had parents in that camp sent care packages to their parents via the Hawaiians. And when the Hawaiians came back, they got it. The reason that these guys didn't go out partying with them and spending a lot of money is because they were spending it all on food and sending it to their parents in the camps. And that finally bonded them. And they still called each other katonks and Buddha heads, but it was, it was more of a shared camaraderie. So to me, it had always been a fascinating story, and I was struggling with a way to tell it, and not have my character, Billy Boyle, the military detective who's at the center of this book, not have a way for him to take center stage because he's really an observer. And I don't want him to be the white knight that comes in and sets everything straight. He has to watch this process and observe it for the reader. And I had to think of a way to come up with a way to get him involved with the 442nd that made sense historically, but also didn't require him to take center stage. So I constructed the story of a vendetta against a British officer in southern France, and was trying to incorporate that into Billy's investigation. And another thing about the 442nd is when they were sent to southern France, they were attached to the 36th Infantry Division, a Texas division. And their general, the 36th Division General Dahlquist, sort of decided it was better to expend these men's lives than his own men's lives. He was one of the most incompetent generals in World War II, even though he managed to keep his job. He was so incompetent that he sent one of his own battalions forward in the Vosges Mountains in southern France and got it surrounded by the Germans. And he was about to lose an entire battalion, which really would have not been good for his career. So he sent in the 442nd, which had already gone through a horrific battle and endured tremendous losses, to rescue about 200 men who were surrounded. And he let his other battalions sit idle while that was happening. They finally did rescue them, to rescue 200 men. They lost 160 dead and 2,000 wounded. So it was a very one-sided affair, but it was one of the places where the 442nd earned a lot of medals for whatever that's worth. But as I was researching this, I found that the battalion that was surrounded had with them 2 French resistance scouts. So I thought, okay, now I've got my French murder, and these 2 scouts are eyewitnesses, but they're trapped behind enemy lines. So Billy Boyle has to stay with the 442nd until they rescue this battalion and bring them out and get the information he needs from the 2 resistance fighters. And that was a way to tell everything I wanted to tell about the 442nd, because there's plenty of time for Billy to get to know them, see what's happening to them. And I was fortunate enough to get 2 real life stories of members of the 442nd and incorporate them into the book, which was a huge help. But before we got there, I had to create this whole mystery of the officer who was killed and the investigation that looks into that. And so we start off in Crete. And I'll sort of pop this cover up again. And the Soho Press does a terrific job on the design of the book covers. And there's kind of a funny story about how this one came to be. I was a big fan, I still am a huge fan of the Guns of Navarone. Who hasn't watched the Guns of Navarone? So if you haven't, you should. And if you remember that with David Niven and Gregory Peck, they land on a Greek island, Navarone, in a small fishing vessel, much like this one. And I was looking around for a picture that might show what that was like, because in the movie, it's in a storm, you can't really see much. So I wanted to recreate my own little Guns of Navarone landing. And I was watching on Netflix a series, a documentary called This Is a Robbery. And if you're at all interested in true crime, This Is a Robbery on Netflix tells a story of the art theft at the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston, where 2 crooks dressed as cops came in the middle of the night and took dozens of paintings, cut them right out of the frames and took them. One of them looked much like this. It was a Rembrandt called Storm on the Sea of Galilee. And there was a self-portrait of Rembrandt and Jesus and his disciples, but we changed all that. But it's virtually, if you happen to look that up, this is where that cover came from, because it was just, the Storm on the Sea of Galilee is just what I imagined for Billy and his crew. So they're going to Crete to pick up a British agent who is necessary for this mission. And I'm going to read, I have to tell you all that our condo is undergoing renovations. That's why the bookshelf is empty behind me. And there's no light in here, and it has gotten dark since I started. So hang on, I'm going to try to read. So this is the start of the book. The sea wanted to swallow me whole. I wouldn't have minded so much if it had been quick. Waves, wave after wave, crashed over the side of the fishing boat, water sluicing across the deck and soaking me as I clung to a knotted rope strung along the gunwale. Crewmen of the small craft shouted to each other, and the captain hung on to the tiller, trying to keep the 30-foot craft on course. I'd ceased to care where we were headed, as long as it wasn't underwater. I was flat on my rear, snug against the hull, hoping and praying that the next wave wouldn't wash me overboard. This was supposed to be the sunny Mediterranean, but it felt more like a nor'easter off Gloucester when the November winds blew cold and hard. 2 days ago, I was in Cairo, relaxing at the bar in Shepherd's Hotel, enjoying a bit of rest hardly suspecting what was coming around the corner. Now, I was listening to my chattering teeth and the British skipper ordering his 5-man crew, 2 Greeks, 2 English, and 1 silent, swarthy fellow of uncertain nationality to hold on tight. He didn't need to tell me twice. I saw the skipper bracing himself, the tiller hard to starboard as he maneuvered the wooden fishing boat, hard to avoid being sideswiped by a giant roller. The problem was that left us with only one alternative: head straight into the wave. Time seemed to slow down. The wave kept coming, growing larger. The crest towering over me, towering over our mast with its furled sails. The long, sharp bow bit into the trough as the frothing breaker spat foaming white and encompassed the small boat. I felt weightless, floating in air, tethered only by a length of rough hemp rope twined around my wrist. I was standing upright in the wave itself, pieces of the ship's great gear floating around me, the world either silent or so filled with this deafening downpour that every other sound was flattened into a bit oblivion. I hit the deck hard, sliding towards the bowsprit as the kayak came through the wave and dropped to the churning surface. The rope held, stopping me before I crashed into the bow, nearly breaking my wrist in the process. But I was alive, on the right side of the rough water, and the next wave wasn't higher than the one at last, than our mast. Lucky me. A crewman, one of the Greeks, came forward to check the rigging. "Hey, English, you still here?" he said, pulling up the forestay line. "American," I said, pulling myself up. "Where is here, anyway? Are we getting close?" "Close, yes," he said, "to the windward shore. Wind not so bad, waves not so bad. Relax, English. We have you there soon, after dark." "American," I said again. Not that he could tell from my uniform. I wore sun-bleached khakis that could have been standard issue from any army in the Med, along with a dark civilian jacket. Aside from my captain's bars and dog tags, there was nothing to identify me as a U.S. Army soldier. The idea was to escape notice by the Germans, but still have enough of a uniform to not be shot as a spy. Sure, American, English, they're all the same to me. I'm Erasmus Papadakis," he said, extending his hand. "Billy Boyle," I said as we shook. "Billy Boyle. Strange name. Okay, I am your guide tonight. I take you ashore," Erasmus said. Before I could ask any questions, he moved on with a steady, rolling seaman's gait, leaving me to lurch about the boat as another wave hit the bow and slammed down over and over. I managed to stay upright, grasping the rigging as I gazed at the horizon. A thin line appeared and soon developed into hills fronted by jagged cliffs. Crete, home to thousands of German occupation troops, a few 100,000 Greeks, or Kokti, as the natives of this island were known, and a handful of British special operation executive types who were busy arming the resistant fighters and keeping the Germans busy burying their dead. So that's Billy's introduction to Crete, and he moves on to southern France and the liberated areas of France. And their mission, with some high-ranking officers, is to investigate the remaining Vichy French, any collaborators or traitors, and make sure that they're brought to justice. But what they don't realize is that there's a rogue group of French resistance fighters who had been part of an uprising just after D-Day in Normandy and before the invasion of southern France in the Vercors Mountains, where they declared the Vercors Republic, expecting that the Allies would come to their aid. But for a variety of reasons, we didn't. And they were slaughtered by the Germans. And the survivors blame a particular officer and go after him. And that's where the investigation takes Billy. And part of the cast of characters in this includes one of the most fascinating women of World War II, known known widely as Christine Granville. Her real name was Christina Skarabek. She was Polish, born to a Jewish mother and a Polish count. She was absolutely incredible. She began working for the British Secret Service as soon as the Germans invaded Poland, made her way to Egypt, across Eastern Europe with critical information. She wasn't believed when she arrived in Cairo because none of the British spy masters thought a woman could have made it from Poland across Eastern Europe into Cairo. But finally, they did believe her, and she was sent into France and just had an incredible activity there. And at this point in the story, she's part of a humanitarian mission with Diana Seaton, who is a fictional character, Billy's love interest, who is also an SOE agent, and they're distributing funds to families, French families who had helped SOE agents and often lost their lives for doing so. So they're helping the survivors, and they all become ensnarled in this plot to gain retribution against the British. So that's the background of the story, and at the end, it does bring Billy face to face with what the 442nd has to endure, and I hope I've told their story in a way that brings some honor and more recognition to them. So I'll stop talking now, and you all can start and ask any questions you might have.
Absolutely. So I am rejoining. I'm Catherine. I am the marketing director at House of Books, to introduce myself to all of you. And I'm rejoining to ask James some questions this evening. So put your questions in the chat if you have any questions for James. But I have a question to kick things off. And so we've spent 17 books now with Billy Boyle. How does it feel spending so much time with the character, and what are the challenges and what are the benefits that you've found to creating such a long-lasting series?
You know, what benefit is I start a new book. I know the characters. I know Billy. I know Kaz, his best friend. So it's fairly easy to start telling the story because I have a template in my mind. The characters, they know each other. I know them. So we sort of have an arrangement. But then I have to introduce, the hard part is writing a new book with the characters that people want to see, but telling a new story each time. Because I really try not to be repetitious. So I try to modulate the setting, the tone of the story, so it's not telling the exact same kind of story each time. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it's easy because I know the characters. It's hard because I have to tweak them a little differently each time, so we tell a different story. Next year's story, Proud Sorrows, is done and sent in, and I finally give these guys a rest. They get some leave, and they go to England and are going to spend some quiet time in a village. But as they say on Masterpiece Mystery, they encounter murder.
Intrigue. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, yeah, and your characters have to grow along with the series, so naturally they have to go through changes as any person would.
Catherine, we have so few people, and I'm not very computer savvy.
Please, Eric, go ahead.
I have a couple of questions. I'm a big fan of your books. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the 442nd, given relative to the number of soldiers in the unit, I think was the highest recipient percentage-wise of Medal of Honor winners in World War II.
It was per capita. You're right.
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
now I'd like to segue back to taking a page out of Paris Review interviews, and I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about how you write. I gather you're very computer literate because I've looked up your past. When do you write? Do you have like a 400 words a day page? Do you work? Because I've read the books, or I haven't read every one of them, but I read most of them. I'd like to be able to know a little bit more about how you have, what your skill set and application is. But I want you to start with why the 1940s DeSoto created all this.
DeSoto? Sure, I get that. Why the 1940s?
Yes.
Well, mainly because when I was a kid, on my street, everybody's dad was in the war, except for one guy. And, that kid was pretty sad because he didn't have any war stories to tell. So I grew up with it as a fairly, it was in the 60s, it was only 20 years ago. So it wasn't that far in the past. And it was part of the whole fabric growing up. And what I think that's one answer. The other is more a little business related. When I wanted to start, when I decided to start writing, I knew I liked mysteries. And I did some research into which genres were selling the best. And historical fiction was at that point, and it's still big, was surging. So I thought, okay, I'll do something historical. And I sort of just fell into, well, what about World War II? And at the time, there were very few series set during World War II, crime fiction series, tons now. But it was like, okay, I that's a niche, and I can fit myself into that. And I thought I knew a lot about World War II, and I've discovered that I had barely scratched the surface. When I talked earlier about research, what I tend to do for any book that I'm working on is, as I'm finishing the last one, I start reading everything I can about the subject of the one I'm going to start working on. And I do that I hardly read anything for enjoyment because I'm usually reading some historical work. And I do get to a point where I have a notebook filled up with notes. I've got a lot of information in my head. And that's when I feel like I've got enough knowledge to write in a way that somebody maybe in 1940 could pick up that book and it would seem familiar to them. That's my goal. The book I'm working on now, which will be for 2 years from now, is set just on the eve of the Battle of the Bulge. So I'm reading everything I can about the Battle of the Bulge, but only up to a certain point because we're not going to go to the end of it. So I stopped reading also when because again, I don't want my characters to know any more than they ought to know. So it's a little trick I try to play on myself is, even though I know what happened, I don't want details about that clogging up my mind. Now, as to writing a routine, to me, 1,000-word day is a great day.
Wow.
Even if, like today, I had a million other things going on and I wrote one paragraph, but I was happy because it was a good paragraph and I didn't have a whole lot of time anyway, so it worked out well. Then I'll often take a few days in a row, and I'm lucky. My wife is a copy editor, so she's in the business, so she understands that if I just lock myself in my office and, don't come out until 8 o'clock at night, it's nothing personal, but, it's just the best way to do it. So I try to write every day, whether it's a little bit or a lot, and keep the story going in my mind.
Let me ask another question because it was curious to me. I think originally you're from New York, aren't you?
I was born in New York City, but lived most of my life in Connecticut.
And then to Connecticut. How did you end up with Billy Boyle as a police detective in Boston, who had apparently through some, if I remember, through some family member that had a relationship with the then unknown Eisenhower at the Supreme. How did all that chain occur?
Well, in trying to come up with this character, two things. One is The Godfather, the movie The Godfather. If you remember the opening scene, the wedding, where Michael Corleone in his Marine Corps uniform is sort of the white sheep of the family. It's August 1945 in that scene. He's the only guy in uniform, and he's ignored. Any other family in America, he would have been the center of attention. And I thought it was interesting that it was sort of an inverted look at how one family viewed the war and the government, because to everybody else, Michael was a sap for going off to fight for his country. Because to them, family mattered, the mob mattered. And I had the thought, like, wouldn't it have been interesting if Sonny was the one that went off into the army? What would that have been like? And I just took that and switched it from the, I guess, New Jersey Mafia, New York Mafia, to Irish Boston. I'm Irish American, so I had that background, and I knew about the police strike in Boston, where finally the Irish could find a place to work because they needed cops. And I swear the alliteration Billy Boyle from Boston popped into my mind. There it was.
That's great.
So you've talked a little bit about the research that you've done specifically for the history portions of your books, but what are some of your like go-to authors or books for inspiration, just generally? Well,
one writer I really admire died recently, Philip Kerr, who wrote the Bernie Gunther series, the German police detective. And his writing is just beautiful. But also he was brilliant in that he did not write chronologically. See, I started this in 1942, and now I am forced to follow a timeline, and it's worked out okay. But what Kerr did is he would write a book, and it might be set in 1920s with something flash forward to 1950s. They were all different. So he had complete freedom to write in whatever time period he wanted, which I thought was brilliant. I really am in awe of his talent. And when I started writing, especially when Robert B. Parker was writing his Spencer series, his ability to use brevity to communicate depth, I thought was just brilliant. So two very different writers, but two different reasons, but those two are great. I like a lot of the British writers. Ian Rankin and his Rebus series are great. I just got a new one. I hope I can get time to read it. So
did you ever I was never quite clear about the outside edges of Billy Boyle's mandate with his investigation. It seemed to me like sometimes he was an investigator, sometimes he was more like a policeman. So he had a number of, in my reading, it seemed like he had a number of different objectives or assignments that he was engaged in that made for a very complicated lifestyle and so forth. Do you see him? I mean, Bernie Gunther, who you mentioned, who I also was thinking about when we were going to chat. Do you see Billy Boyle as having any outside edges to his obligations with respect to the Supreme Headquarters?
Here's the thing. I think of Billy Boyle almost as a Zelig character. Remember Woody Allen's movie Zelig, about a guy in the 30s, I think it was, who just took on the attributes of anybody he was around. Or maybe a little bit of Forrest Gump, because if you watch Forrest Gump, he was, with every historical character you could imagine. So I try to be careful because I want to be realistic, but if you think about it, it's totally unrealistic that this character would move in all these arenas so easily and meet all these people, from the Pope to Winston Churchill to Richard Nixon and Jack Kennedy.
Right.
I try not to think about it too much, because if I do, I think the readers might think about it. So it's sort of like a magician's trick. You don't really want the reader to see how the wires are all pulled, because it's a little unbelievable. So, but the advantage is he works for General Eisenhower, so he can go anywhere, he can do anything.
Okay.
And he doesn't have to be answerable to the people who are higher ranked than he is.
I think we have another question from Thomas.
Yes, Jim, I wanted to just throw in that early in the series, you did basically establish Billy as being at Eisenhower's, serving at the, they say serving at the pleasure of the president. Well, he was serving at the pleasure of General Eisenhower, and his main goal was to keep problems off of Eisenhower's desk so that Eisenhower can concentrate on fighting the war. And so as these various complications came up, no matter what they were technically part of his mandate. So that gave you the sort of the freedom to be as creative or outrageous as you wanted to. But also I wanted to comment on something you had said about what I consider to be, your story arc that starts in 42 and is now in 44. As a reader, I appreciate, well, there's a double-edged thing there. On one hand, it's an ongoing story, but you have managed, how I'm not sure, but you managed to make these freestanding. In other words, it drives me nuts these days because modern television has a lot of continuing stories. And if I happen to, friends are telling me, oh, you've got to watch this, you have to watch this, you have to watch this. I turn it on. I don't know what the hell's going on because I haven't seen the previous 5 episodes. And I'm not into, quote, streaming. And so when I tell people I'm reading a series of mystery novels, I say I'm on the 17th one. Some of them indeed look at me and say, do I have to read the first 16 in order to appreciate number 17? And what you've been able to do is answer no, because even though, if you want to go back and start, it's a lovely story arc. It's not necessary because you have a way of telling the novice reader exactly what he needs to know in order to appreciate this one volume. And I've always thought that. I don't know where you got that gift, because quite honestly, I have read some books similarly in series that one lady, I liked the book, but she told me so much about what happened in the previous books. I never have to read them because she gave away all the punchlines. And that to me is just absolute strangeness. But also I used to read the Elliott Roosevelt books that were supposedly about his, his mother was always getting involved with murder in the White House and that sort of thing. I love them very much, but it was what you were talking about earlier, where one was set in 1933. They just move into the White House. The next one's 1943. And wait a minute, because I got it in my head who these characters are. Now suddenly they're totally different. And while they were true to the whatever era he had chosen for that particular novel, it did not make sense, because I knew her from that book, and now she's different. She's 12 years older. So anyway, I like the ongoing story arc as a reader. So I appreciate what you've been able to do 17 times. I guess that's my question. Would you have done it? Would you have started this if you had known you were going to be married to these characters and for 17 years? And
no conception. When I got my first contract, I had the first 2 books written. And I at that point, I was just happy to think about doing a third. So no, I just keep writing. I calculated it's about 250,000 words so far,
wow.
Maybe a little under in these
Wow.
books. So can I just tell you something I'm excited about for next year's book? Because I mentioned about differentiating the books and having them be different. So next year's book, it's an English village mystery. And I don't know if any of you are fans of the Lord Peter Wimsey series on Masterpiece Mystery with Ian Carmichael. Well, I discovered that Ian Carmichael, guess what, was in World War II, was a tank officer with the 22nd Dragoons, and would have been back in England picking up some intelligence information at the time of the story. So I've got Lord Peter Wimsey essentially, but it's Ian Carmichael, the actor, as a character, as a very young man. And it was great fun to write because I read his autobiography and he sounds like Lord Peter Wimsey. So I got to write him in that tone and had a lot of fun with it. And now I've discovered that David Niven was involved in the Battle of the Bulge as an intelligence officer on General Montgomery's staff. So now I'm having a blast thinking about how to incorporate David Niven, who is a marvelous liar and a great storyteller. So that ought to be
a terrible actor.
Well, we look forward to reading that next book, James, and we appreciate you spending your evening with us here tonight. Thank you so much.
Yes,
little
that's
round of
great.
applause for you.
Thank all of you.
Yes, it was terrific.
Thank you.
Link to purchase From the Shadows is in the link, and I'll let Brittany just close us out here.
I was going to say you can, of course, head to House of Books website and order copies of 2 books.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all again for joining us this evening. Have a great night.
Okay.